রসের রসিক না হলে কোথায় সে অটল রূপের বারাম দেয় রসের রসিক না হলে কে গো জানতে পায় রসের রসিক না হলে
So, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Om-gnosis, the Occult South Asia podcast. I am Keith Cantú, a research affiliate here at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. And today I have the great privilege of welcoming Dr. Gordan Djurdjevic, independent scholar, contributor to anthologies, Aleister Crowley and Western Esotericism, Esotericism, Religion and Politics, and many, many other publications that I hope we'll get to talk about. You're also the co-editor with Henrik Bogdan of the collection of essays Occultism and a Global Perspective, and the author of Masters of Magical Powers, the Nāth Yogis, and the Light of Esoteric Notions, and of course, India and the Occult, the influence of South Asian spirituality on modern Western occultism. In addition to a book called Sayings of Gorakhnāth, Annotated Translation of the Gorakh Bānī with Shukdev Singh. And your current book has the working title of Aleister Crowley and Oriental Wisdom, Influences and Correlations Between Thelema and Asian Thought. And so it's a really great, privilege to have you. I've known you for maybe 10, 15 years now. I don't know. You
something like that.
You had first been sweeping through, I think, on a little bit of a book tour promoting India and the occult in Seattle, I think, is when I first
Actually,
met.
I think it was the Esoteric Book Conferences in Seattle that I was attending, and perhaps this is one of the first occasions that we met. But I think it was Seattle anyway.
Mm-hmm. Definitely Seattle. So if you can, tell us a little bit about your background, especially what drew you into the study of occultism, which it can be, considered sometimes a pretty niche field. And then South Asia and academia more generally.
Yeah. Well, kind of in many respects, people, when asked such questions, go with, I don't even know when it started, how it started. But in my case, I know definitely the way and when it started. It was winter break when I was in the first grade of high school. So that was 1974, 1975, either December or January.
Okay.
A friend acquired a book called The Psychic Training of the Yogis. I was living in Bosnia, former Yugoslavia at the time, and that was a kind of a pioneering work on the subject. And this was a book by Živorad Mihailović Slavinsky, who later kind of have an even international career as a writer on various forms of spirituality. His later books tended to be more new agey, but first 4 or 5 books were mostly starting with yoga and then moving to Western Hermeticism. So kind of this book, The Psychic or Psychological Training of Yogis, is paradigmatic in several respects because on the one hand, so the publication took place in what was kind of a socialist country, soft communist country. Yugoslavia was not part of the Russian bloc, so kind of we had much more freedom than the other communist countries, but it was still kind of officially a communist country. So the author was a psychologist, and then kind of this aspect that we have learned was also very, very typical for a modern occultism, kind of a mixing between scientific approach and this spiritual metaphysical approach. So he tried as a psychologist to present yoga as being a scientifically valid discipline. So kind of that was in itself quite interesting and quite typical, you might say. Then also what was very interesting about this book was that it presented yoga and Western Hermeticism as branches stemming from the same trunk, stemming from the same root. So kind of immediately there was this sort of a correlation between Eastern and Western Hermeticism being displayed. in this work. But as far as I was concerned, kind of after reading this book, I kind of finished at night, then started at night, and then finished next morning, early in the morning, after waking up. And it was a complete, not a culture shock, but kind of a cultural revolution. I kind of suddenly became convinced that this is the most important thing in life, kind of to practice yoga and to reach the state of samadhi and to study, to kind of to learn all of that, and kind of this started kind of this early obsession, never really left me. Although it took many various aspects, dimensions, or whatnot. About 2 years after that, it was in 1977. I was not yet 18. I, with two other friends, we traveled to Zagreb, nowadays capital of Croatia, at the time capital of Republic of Croatia, part of Yugoslavia. We went for several days on not really a retreat, but kind of in order to participate in joining the transcendental meditation by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, kind of receiving mantras and starting this process of transcendental meditation.
TM, right?
Sorry? TM, yes.
yeah.
TM,
Okay.
yes, exactly, yeah. And again, kind of given that this was still, Tito was still alive, this was still officially communism, so they didn't quite advertise themselves as a transcendental meditation group, but as they were actually. I'm just now I'm blanking. I think they advertised themselves as a society for psychophysical relaxation.
Okay.
But anyway, it was transcendental meditation. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. We received our mantras. I started meditating and kind of quit after a week or so, because I entered into a moral dilemma. If this is really so revolutionary, if this is really so beneficial, why does it involve payments, and why is it not kind of advertised for free? I had some moral issues with that. Then at some point, I became very much interested in the Hare Krishna movement, based on an article in a kind of some journal. Again, this is kind of like late 70s, and we were not completely sure how does this thing go, but we learned this kind of a very interesting kind of a detailed article that George Harrison was the first who introduced the Hare Krishna mantra to the West. So, okay, where the hell is this My Sweet Lord song? Oh, I have a single. Let's hear how it goes. As a kind of interesting, scholarly, annoying footnote, isn't it kind of a bit counterproductive that the Hare Krishna mantra was introduced to the West by this George Harrison song a bit incorrectly, because it's supposed to be vocative, oh Hari, oh Krishna, which is Hare Krishna, Hare Ram, and Harrison sing, in the background singers, they sing Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, which is kind of a nominative, not a vocative case, but who cares? It's a good song, yeah. Anyway, we kind of started also singing a bit Hare Krishna, and yeah. So kind of those are my early interests. But as I said, this particular writer, Slavinsky, his later books after this one about psychic training of yogis, they turned to Western Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Golden Dawn. He talked positively about Crowley, and he published a book with some short biographies of some major occult figures. It was called The Psychonauts of Inner Worlds.
Psychonauts of Inner Worlds. Okay.
Yeah, I talked about this in my contribution to this anthology that I edited with Henrik Bogdan, Occultism in a Global Perspective. I talked about occultism in former Yugoslavia. So this a book, The Psychonauts of the Inner Worlds. It had a short biographical chapter on Blavatsky, on Rudolf Steiner, brief kind of history of the Golden Dawn. It had a chapter on Israel Regardie, but the main kind of a chapter was on Aleister Crowley, and I think that the title of the chapter was "The King of the Royal Art," and Crowley was presented in a very romantic fashion as a kind of not only as a major occultist or whatnot, but kind of the prophet of the new eon. And it was very passionately written. And, I was kind of completely taken by that. But at the time, I did not know English. And, all I knew about Crowley, which later became one of my main interests, consisted of few quotations. And that was pretty much it. Later, a book was published with a description of the tarot cards, with kind of also reproductions in black and white, and also kind of that was mind-blowing. So kind of that was in terms of my interests in general. Scholarly, I studied literature and language at the University of Belgrade. I was a very bad student. I think it took me 11 years to get my BA.
Oh, no.
I was completely disinterested after the first few months. I stopped attending the lectures, then returned home, work in a hotel as a receptionist for a couple of years, went to kind of army. It was kind of obligatory. You have to serve your stint in the army, 15 months or whatnot. And then finally, somehow I managed to finish and started working in a local library back home, and got married, had a son, and kind of life was getting quite nice. And then the war started, and when in 1991, I left Bosnia in 1992, where the war started in April. I left in November. In 1993, I arrived with the family to Canada and spent 2 years working as a gardener, kind of cutting lawns, lawnmower and stuff. And then I believe in 96, I started the University of British Columbia, spent 1 year as an unclassified student, took some classes mostly in religious studies because I wanted to do graduate work in religious studies.
Sure.
And then I did my MA in Department of that. At the time, it was Department of Religious Studies. Now it changed the name, and my focus was in Jewish mysticism, but kind of also mysticism in general, approached as a general kind of a religious phenomenon. And I believe around it was year 2000 when I started PhD program at the Asian Studies, also at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. My PhD supervisor was Ken Bryant. I did, studied some Sanskrit, studied some Hindi, studied some Punjabi. And then when it was time to select a thesis, I was at the time mostly impressed by David Gordon White's Your Supervisors book on what was the name of the book?
Alchemical Body.
Alchemical Body, yeah. It's kind of I was really fascinated by the book. That seemed very, very interesting to me. And I wanted to focus kind of on something much smaller. So I suggested to my supervisor just to work on the Gorakh Bānī, sayings of Gorakhnāth, as kind of one collection of text. And I said that, my major interest is in religious ideas, religious side of it. I'm kind of, philology was my always secondary interest, not particularly. I wasn't interested in going into kind of various textual comparisons between, mostly religious ideas. And I was when I started kind of preparing for the thesis, I was told you need to have a model, how are you going to approach this? What is going to be your model? And I kind of started developing headache trying to figure out what model to approach. And, kind of in those days, I tended to spend a lot of time in the library, kind of just kind of searching for various possible books that relate to what I was researching, and I came across Antoine Faivre's Access to Western Esotericism.
Yeah.
And so kind of that book was published in English maybe like 5-6 years before I came across it. I was completely unaware of it. And I was completely unaware of the fact that there was such thing as a discipline of the study of esotericism. I learned then that there is this kind of department in Amsterdam, that there is a journal, at the time there was not yet encyclopedia published, that there are kind of some scholarly associations. So kind of it completely opened a new world to me, because to me that was something that was of the major interest to me, but it was always somehow, I assumed that was something you kind of have to keep separate from your academic work, because you cannot academically study occult and hermeticism and all of this. And now it suddenly became possible. And so I immediately wanted to use this approach, this to be my model. And perhaps first cut is the deepest. Perhaps this first book that I read when I was a teenager that kind of argued that yoga and Western magic are the branches stemming from the same root. And because I was very much influenced also by Crowley, who also was deeply into this idea that he expressed, is that when the Japanese think of Hachiman and when the Hebrew thinks about the Lord of the Hosts, these are not two thoughts, but one thought. He argued that behind these various local manifestations, there lie deeper, similar or the same truths. And I was always predisposed to view things in such a way. And this is possibly a flaw, but I have also some premonition that nobody is without certain predispositions in their worldview, and that you have to have your own and be aware of it. Anyway, it seemed to me that it was possible to take this concept of esotericism and to apply it to the Nāth siddhis, and more broadly to Indian yoga and to tantra, and even more broadly, it seemed to me obvious that concept of esotericism can be applied cross-culturally to other non-Western areas of manifestations of cultural and religious life. And so kind of pretty much everything that I have done since my PhD thesis, which was in 2005, until now, was kind of variations on this theme and kind of explorations of this basic idea. I'm mostly interested academically in the comparison between Western and non-Western forms of esotericism, or the influence of Asian philosophies and spiritual system onto Western esotericism, hermeticism, occultism, however one wants to call it. And kind of lately, for the most part, I'm focusing on Aleister Crowley, because it seems to me that I have expressed this idea several times. There are too many biographies of Crowley and very little exploration of his religious ideas, and I think it's a gold mine. I mean, Crowley was a complicated character. There are many things that he did or said that I strongly dislike, but aside from that obvious fact, there are so many interesting ideas that can be found in this person that considers himself to be a prophet of a new religious movement. This new religious movement is somehow alive and well and seems to be growing, and it seems quite an interesting area of inquiry. That's kind of pretty much it. What was that a complicated answer to a simple question?
No, but it's a great window into sort of, the diversity of your interests and how sort of they came to fruition. I think I'd like to pick up on the sort of latter half of your question and kind of skip ahead. You're talking about your dissertation a little bit, and it became published as a book as the Nāth Yogis as Masters of Magical Powers. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of briefly talk about the Nāth Yogis and how their work could be compared with magic. I'm assuming it has to do with the idea of siddhis, and I read it long ago, I think when I was in grad school. But I'm curious sort of how you're framing that in terms of this model. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure, the cities are an aspect of it, but when I was working on the thesis, I actually, and this was somewhat, many things were controversial, but it was somewhat controversial that I took Febvre's model with kind of 4 major and 2 minor aspects of esotericism and applied all of them to the Nāth Yogis.
Okay.
Not because I assume that this is a kind of some perfect model that needs to be followed whenever we try to approach and understand and interpret something, but because I had somewhat kind of maybe even a silly idea. I wanted to get this point across, that even if you take this particular model that was specifically developed in response to Western esoteric tradition,
Sure.
it was intentionally kind of a focus on just the Western esoteric tradition. So even if we take this particular specific model and apply this to the Nāth Yogis or to yoga and tantra in general, even then it fits. Even such specific model fits if we kind of try to use it as a lens to look at this other system. So for this reason, I kind of spent in my dissertation, I kind of analyze all of these aspects. So Febvre talks about primarily as a 4 major aspects of esotericism, according to him. He starts with the correspondences, analogy, kind of a sympathy, like attracts like, as above, so below. And we have this present in Indian tradition, starting from the Upanishads. If you want to, you can even go further. But the Upanishads are essentially internalization of the Vedic ritual, kind of moving away from the ritual to meditation, understanding that, for example, the necessity of the altar with the fire can be taken esoterically up, when I use this term. So then the inner heat becomes the fire, and the controlled breath becomes the oblation. So they internalize this Vedic sacrifice and replace ritual with meditation. But this move is impossible unless you understand that there is an analogy, correspondence, sympathy between these acts. And kind of the whole notion of bandhu, that is that literally means relation, but kind of it's a relationship, correspondence.
Friend even, yeah.
Yeah. So this seems to me to be the kind of in alignment with this Febvrean concept of correspondence or analogy or analogical thinking as the major aspect of esotericism. And then also in the case of the Nāth Yogis, who believe that it is possible to acquire the elixir of immortality, Amrita, which kind of then confers the status of divinity, because gods are amars, those who are immortal. And you acquire this elixir of immortality based on the ideas of the Nāth Yogis by the sublimation of the semen, and through celibacy, but also kind of through the reversal of the flow of semen, because according to their medical ideas that are kind of shared by some other also Indian yogic and tantric traditions, at the at the top of the head, even above the head, Sahasrara chakra, kind of this is the origin of the immortality, Amrita, Rasa, but then kind of it trickles down and kind of it turns into semen that is kind of ejaculated, which leads to the old age and immortality. So to reverse this process, to stop aging and to stop mortality, you kind of have to do the return path of the semen that will kind of eventually become, again, return to the state of Amrita, immortality, elixir of immortality. But you are essentially, again, operating with the principle of correspondence. You are suggesting, I mean, the Nāth Yogis suggest that there is a correlation, correspondence, analogy, sympathy between elixir and the semen, between the spiritual idea, concept, power, and the material substance,
Right.
secretion or whatnot. So kind of that seems to me to be the obvious. And there are many, I mentioned some other aspects of correspondence in my thesis, which I can't remember. Then imagination, kind of the importance of imagination, imaginal world. When we think of the chakras, when we think of the kundalini, when we think of the subtle bodies, when we think of kind of meditation that incorporates, circulating breath while imagining that the kind of a prana or kundalini goes through chakras, and when we imagine when in the yogic meditation, the certain chakras are associated with certain colors, which you then kind of engage in your meditation. This is all kind of putting imagination into practice, into practical use. So kind of, again, there is this correlation. Then the living nature, I argue that kind of would be Shakti. Living nature, Shakti, especially in tantric tradition that operate with the concept of the Shiva and Shakti, where kind of Shiva is the sort of a immortal, pure consciousness, and his kind of a correlate, his other aspect is this material world, Shakti, that kind of, in a sense, emanates from him, but from another point of view, they are in the constant state of conjugal union. Then the whole world becomes Shakti, and in that sense, this is a living nature. So kind of the correlation between there, and then kind of experience of transmutation, which to a large degree in West, as in India and China, and where not, most closely relates to the practice of alchemy as a science of transformations or transmutations. Well, with the Nāth Yogis, it was precisely transmutation, that kind of a transmutation of the semen into elixir of immortality, that makes the religious project possible. And the kind of the practice of concordance, and kind of there is one other aspect with kind of a ritual transmission of knowledge. Can't remember at the moment what term Favre uses. Yogis have their initiations. They have a kind of a institution of a disciple, guru and a disciple, where the knowledge is ritually transmitted. In some cases, this involves also kind of exchange of substances or whatnot. But basically, there is a kind of ritual of initiation. There is a secret knowledge. There is something that is kept just within the group, not publicly displayed.
Right.
There is also coded discourse. A number of other similarities that seem to me justify exploration of the Nāth Yogis or yoga or tantra in general through these lenses of esotericism. And it was never my intention to argue that this could be the only or the primary approach to the subject, but just as one of the possible ways in which we can look at this complex phenomenon. I mean, we can approach yoga, tantra sociologically, through literary studies. We can approach it philosophically, religiously. There are so many kind of, so this is just one of the ways that at the time seemed to me have been less explored, and that justified kind of this approach.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense to me. And honestly, hearing you talk, it's making me wonder, how many feathers would be ruffled if I used, comparative frames from yoga and tantric studies and applied them to the study of esotericism or Western esotericism. Like that might actually also be really
Sure,
interesting to
sure.
do as a
Yeah, yeah,
comparative frame. And yeah,
you can go and say that kind
yeah,
of yes, in the Western magical system, we also have mandalas. They
yeah.
call them circles, but they are basic mandalas, and they also use mantras. They call them words of power or the barbar names of evocation, but they are basically mantras, and you can go like that.
Sure. Well, on that note, to play devil's advocate a little bit, the phenomenology of religion, right? Or, put simply, kind of finding ways to compare these similarities has taken quite a hit, I would say, in past decades, as scholars have mostly sort of tended to drift towards history of religion, especially framing esotericism, yogic studies, all these things, very very historically, but it seems that it might be on the rise again. I mean, I just from conversations with colleagues and students and so on. And I'm wondering kind of what you say in response to critics of this kind of phenomenological approach in terms of how scholars can be open to compare religious similarities, like the ones that you've been talking about just now, while still kind of critically addressing distinctions between cultures and practices and so on.
Yeah. I mean, there are several ways of approaching or of answering this question
Mm,
or approaching this potential problem. First of all, I think that it is beneficial if we have a variety of approaches. I would never
mm,
argue that the phenomenological approach, for example, or a formal structural approach is the only possible approach, or that even is the best.
mm,
But some people are good at one, some people are good at other approach, and
sure.
I think that it is great if you have a variety of approaches. We also know that kind of a cultural fashions go through the
Mm,
cycles, and or maybe it's just a spiral, and hopefully, kind of when things return, they have a bit more sophistication. Uh, so that in that sense we have learned something from the criticism and from differing approaches to the same issue. Um, then when it comes to the issue of comparison, I mean, you can actually argue that all knowledge is structured based on the comparison. Kind of a difference is one aspect of comparison. When things are
mm,
different, then we have, if you say that A is not B, you have done a comparison. You have compared A and B, and you
that's
have
true.
decided they are not the same.
Mm,
And we do know that knowledge is structured based on difference. Kind of this is from structural linguistics. We know that is the structural linguistics or it is general linguistics. Now I can't remember the exact term of art. The language is structured based on the difference,
mm,
so Sear, his argument was that when we learn language, we don't learn things based on their identity, but based on their difference.
mm,
So up is what is not down, black is what is not white.
mm, mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
this goes even to the phonetic structure of a language, where the ba, pa is kind of a distinguish between whether one sound is a closed sound, plosive, or whether it is open as a consonant. So
mm.
trying to say that kind of a comparison is actually quite fundamental for the acquisition of knowledge and for our learning something about the reality of things. So I don't see a particular problem with the comparison as such. Nothing inherently problematic, except that kind of some people and some scholars think that certain other aspects of a subject need to be brought into closer focus and studied, and of course I have no problem with that. And finally, I guess I'm thinking of Jeffrey Kripal,
Mm,
who is often described as a person who put religion back in the study of religion. And it seems to me that kind of perhaps this phenomenological approach has something to do with this kind of yes, we can learn so many things if we study gender relationship, if we study social aspect of phenomenon, if we study, we have learned so much from postmodernism. We have learned about constructed nature of our ideas about reality, of our social institutions. We have learned that things are relative, that they are trying to think of another term for constructed, and it escapes my mind at the moment. But also, I don't think that there is a particularly problematic if we kind of also study religious aspects of religions. I don't know, yeah, something of the sort. But I would basically just say that it was. I would never argue that particular approach has to be the only valid approach to study. So kind of a variety of approaches is great, and not even so. For example, often it was said as a critique of so-called religionist approach to esotericism that only historical study are the most fruitful. And I agree, historical approach and historical study is fantastic, and it probably needs to remain the main. I would only argue, but not the only one. There should be place for some other approaches, so we can also take a view of a thing from a different angle, and that's about it.
Yeah, it sounds much more inclusive. And I mean, on a personal note, like I am grateful to Jeff Kripal's former students who are the reason that I'm, here actually, and able to do this podcast is I think that there is, at least, he and, some other colleagues have really been instrumental in kind of putting this idea of experience, religious experience, back in the picture. And yeah, it's great that you're able to do that in this particular domain. And I'm curious, sort of, going to your book, circling back, India and the Occult, right? It was a pioneering publication before there was any Occult South Asia, workshop or Vienna. And I think very, very few people were even looking at, things in this frame. So what was the inspiration for this book? You mentioned Crowley. I'm sure there were others, as well. And what for you is the importance of paying closer attention to this word occult and, the occult and so on?
Yes. It seemed to me that actually the word occult is a bit more specific and bit more appropriate when applied to people such as Aleister Crowley or Kenneth Grant or Dan Fortune. It seemed to me that to call them esotericists, while not wrong, somehow softens the edge of what they appear to have been doing, talking, writing about, etc. And I would actually like here to mention few things which I think are important. First of all, I know that we just mentioned recently that kind of there are these cultural fashions where kind of ideas and concepts and popularity of things goes through various cycles. Things become popular, lose their importance, popularity, and then become popular again. So in that sense, there has been recently a certain move on part of certain scholars to get rid of the notion Western in describing Western esotericism. I believe that there was one editorial of the journal Correspondences online that was kind of, I believe, framed, titled along those lines, "Time to Get Rid of Western esotericism." And I have nothing to say about this. People have their own approaches, and they are perfectly capable to explain the reason behind them. I just wanted personally to state that this was never my intention. I never suggested or wanted to suggest that we should get rid of the adjective Western in describing Western esotericism. My own approach has always been from the beginning only this one, that we cannot take Western esotericism to be the unique and only form of esotericism. So I'm completely okay and fine. I think it makes sense to operate with the concept of Western esotericism because I think it differs from, let's say, Indian esotericism or Chinese esotericism. But at the same time, I do think that there is such thing as Chinese or Indian or African esotericism. My suggestion has been to apply this concept of esotericism, which I take to be a second degree scholarly concept, not necessarily native concept. We can apply it historically, ancient, medieval, contemporary. We can apply it denominationally, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu. We can apply it geographically, European, North American, Chinese, Indian, etc. So in that sense, I kind of really feel that we do not need to get rid of the concept of Western esotericism, but we cannot take. I'm adamant about this, that we cannot take this to be the only form of esotericism. I remember that one early criticism of my concept was of my use of the concept Indian esotericism was that when we talk about Western esotericism, there is a very specific line of descent. It was typically taken to be 15th century Florentine Academy, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and these people, and then kind of their response to, on the one hand, Plato and the Platonic and late antique Neoplatonism, and then kind of a trajectory that goes all the way to kind of a Golden Dawn, Crowley, etc., etc. Kind of in that sense that it is very specific, and that if you want to include India into this and kind of a yoga and tantra, then kind of it completely is incongruent, kind of it doesn't make sense. And to me, it doesn't make sense only if we take that only West has esotericism. So kind of in that sense, then no, then there is only Western. But if we take the ideas and concepts, and this is where I think the use of the term conceptual metaphor that was developed by a scholar from University of British Columbia here in Vancouver, Edward Cantú, in his book on Wu Wei as a conceptual metaphor.
He's done a lot of work in cognitive science of religion recently, I think. Yeah.
But the basic idea is simple. The presence of the concept and the presence of the metaphor about the concept do not have to coexist at the same time. So kind of in that sense, I would say the concept of esotericism can be observed in many regional, denominational, and historical contexts without necessarily the term esotericism as such being used. So I seem to have strayed away from your question, India and the occult. Why have I used the term occult, the occult? Yeah, it seemed to me that the occult has a bit of an edge that seemed to me appropriate when applied to these people such as Crowley, Grant, etc. And at the same time, I also, as a conceptual metaphor, I think that it has a significant presence also in India, kind of when we talk about Gupta sadhana and similar things, that there is kind of almost parallel conceptual congruence between Western and Indian terms. So it seemed to me that the occult was an appropriate term.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts bubbling, but I would say probably the most that's emerging is sort of the implications of saying that there can only be one form of esotericism, like you're kind of pushing back against. Also, I think could be limiting and, very problematic in terms of other people and other fields that would want to even use this word esotericism. It's almost like saying that you can't use this. As an example, like there was a talk just 2 weeks ago here at the center. Someone was presenting on esoteric Buddhism, which has its
Hmm.
own, long
Yeah,
trajectory and even that
yeah,
phrase, right?
yeah.
And so it was just like while you were talking, I was thinking, well, if if I have this position that, well, Western esotericism is the only esotericism, then that means actually that I would have to say, hey, sorry, you can't really use this word
Yeah, yeah,
esoteric,
yeah,
and that creates a whole host of problems too,
yeah,
in my view,
yeah,
in
yeah,
terms of
totally.
limiting. Yeah.
I think that in India, occult, I have used the example of Wittgenstein criticizing Fraser,
Mm,
his Golden Bough, because kind of Fraser kept talking about savages who
mm,
are kind of talking about these things. But then Wittgenstein said something to the effect that kind of uh, just the fact that in our language we have a response to certain activities, certain ideas, and certain actions that we can describe as magical. This somehow suggests that kind of there is also magic in our society, not just among savages. I'm kind of butchering his argument here, but yeah, I mean, aside from the discipline of the study of esotericism, scholars have been using adjective esoteric to describe Buddhism,
mm,
uh,
mm,
among other things, for for
mm,
decades,
mm,
like decades before
mm,
the discipline of esoteric studies was kind of formally established at universities. And why do we feel the urge to use that adjective is because we kind of notice that there is a certain similarity there. And it makes perfect sense. Here, kind of esoteric Buddhism talk about something that is
mm,
a bit more inner, hidden, transmitted through metaphors, through symbols, through initiations, etc. It is not a plain language. My favorite example is from Kalachakra Tantra,
mm,
where, for example, the Dalai Lama talks about, he initiates in the Kalachakra Tantra huge
mm,
amounts of people, kind of for
mm,
a specific reason. But Kalachakra Tantra, among other things, says that you have to kill your mother and your father.
mm,
So then, are we saying that the Dalai Lama is a person who is introducing people in a cult that wants
mm.
people to kill their parents? No, killing one's parents is an esoteric way of saying that you have to get rid of your karma, because
Mm.
karma is what conditioned you, what kind of makes you who you are at a particular time and place. So this is an example of the use of metaphorical or esoteric language in the context of esoteric religion. So
Mm.
yeah.
And there's this whole kind of, rehabilitation aspect to it, because you were bringing up words like savage, other
Yeah.
people have brought up words, like primitive, which are very problematic, in these kind of, colonial contexts, and we're
Totally.
used to, I think, really denigrate and push these ideas like esotericism and, occult practices and say that they're irrational superstition or, like that. And I think that that does a lot of work in thinking about these categories and what scholars can do to be open and
Mm. Yeah.
reevaluating them and thinking about them in a
Yeah.
more open-minded way.
Yeah. Well, sometimes also kind of a re-evaluation happens when you intentionally adopt a denigrated concept or a name and use it kind of with pride,
Mm.
which
Hmm.
is what Crowley did with magic based on his own account.
Magic here,
He
yes.
says,
Uh-huh.
"Yeah, I took a word that was kind of associated with superstition and decided to kind of give it back its original glory or something of the sort."
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Yeah. Do you have anything more to say on magic here and how magic might, correspond with occult or occultism?
well, yeah, kind of in
Mm.
in a sense, it is. it is really difficult to make a clear-cut distinctions between magic, esoteric, occult, mystic,
Mistake. Yeah.
etc. So in a sense, the kind of the issue is semantics. What is our preferred vocabulary? What is our preferred nomenclature? I think that I have tended to take esotericism to be the broadest, the most broad concept, and kind of occult a bit more narrow, and kind of magic even more narrow. But when we talk about magic, it is interesting to me when applied to Indian situation, for example. Two things I find to be very interesting. One of them is that perhaps the earliest or very early term for magic in India was karma.
Okay, yeah.
Because karma originally came into being, unless I'm misremembering my studies, from the Vedic ritual that was based on the idea that when you do a ritual, then the outcome is automatic.
The karma kanda, right? Yeah.
So karma was initially the outcome of the performance of the Vedic ritual, and then later became broadened to the sense that means it is the outcome of every act, not only ritual act, but of every act. So kind of I think that this is important and interesting how magic can be applied to almost everything, which then brings us back to Mr. Crowley, who says that magic is science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will, and that every willed action is a magical action. And I think that he used the term of blowing one's nose to define or to describe magic. So kind of if you miss the nose, then kind of that's a badly performed magical act. But if you manage to kind of hit the nose and kind of blow it, so that's a successful magical operation. So kind of from karma meaning ritual action and the outcome of ritual action to mean outcome of every action, to kind of magic mean every willed action. Some interesting kind of similarities there and commonalities. And another interesting thing that I have to say about that is to me interesting when it comes to Indian tradition and magic is that yogi or jogi is often a synonym for a magician in India, in a similar way that kind of a yogini can also be translated conceptually, what it means as a witch. And things tend to be simultaneously very simple and quite complex at the same time, which can be quite maddening.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah. And so there's the magic with a C, and then some of the people who are just listening, there's also the magic with a K. And I'm curious, sort of, most of the time when magic is studied in the context of India or South Asia, with just the C, MAGIC, usually the emphasis is on sort of, for lack of a better word, like lower kinds of rituals to sort of, harm other people or to, create some sort of change or manipulate. There's the Shatkarmas, these 6 magical acts and so on. And I'm wondering, it seems like you focus certainly on the more kind of soteriological aspects of magic, magic in this kind of, higher sense, that's related to yoga and self-realization. But I'm curious how you see the relationship there, if you could speak to that a little bit. I know some listeners would certainly be interested to hear that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have started from this. Conceptually, I have started from this notion that not siddhas are those who possess siddhis, and siddhis are powers, which are so big that we call them magical powers. Kind of, they are extraordinary powers, and kind of this brings me to the idea that I think that magic is sort of almost a synonym to power. And I believe that I have defined, even in my thesis, magic as that form of religion in which sacred manifests as power. Sacred manifests as power, almost like Shakti. So magic and the magical power, and then there is actually this interesting distinction that is mostly applied to some forms of yoga and tantra, the distinction between mumukshu and bupukshu, between a person who is seeking deliverance from the world, escape from samsara, and the person who seeks enjoyment through the development of magical powers, where basically person becomes divine and enjoys the unlimited power and freedom that stem from such condition. Alexis Sanderson wrote about this perhaps most eloquently, but he also really makes clear that this distinction does exist in Indian tradition, where majority position is that the world is a vicious cycle of suffering from which one needs to escape. But then a minority position among some tantrikas is that one needs not to escape from the world, but one needs to become divine and then enjoys in the exercise of these magical powers that simultaneously provide immortality and freedom. Yeah.
So then, related to that, since we're going back to the the yogic material, the audience is probably more familiar with your comparative work, but you've also, as I mentioned, collaborated with Shukdev Singh to publish sayings of Gorakhnāth, the annotated translation of the Gorakh Bānī. So what was it like working on this project? And maybe you could sort of tie in the significance of these songs to audiences with an interest in South Asia or occultism in general.
Yeah, well, I mostly worked with Shukdev Singh when I was actually living in India for 7 months as a PhD student based on the grant from the Shastri Institute. I was living in Benares, and very early I got in touch through some mutual friends with this retired professor from the Benares Hindu University, Shukdev Singh, who prior to that collaborated with Linda Hess on the translation of Kabir.
The Bijak, I think.
English,
right?
Yes, yeah, Bijak of Kabir, yes. So I would ride my bike, go to his place, and we would work on the translation. He called this fighting with the text.
Fighting.
Yeah. He said that he had a very good memory of the Gorakh Bānī because when he was a student, he read the book. And he was retired at the time.
Okay, all right. Wow. So that's
like 50 years ago, I read the book, so I know it very well. Yeah. But also working with him and I would typically do my own translations, then bring them, and then he would check them. And sometimes he was like, "Oh, this is great," or like, "Oh, no."
Okay.
So it was all over the place. But listening to him, his explanations, his commentaries on both on the text and the larger issues related to the Nāth Yogis and Indian culture in general, I also became aware of this aspect that they are mostly about this particular dignity of power. That their way of life provides them with a dignity based on their experience and success in doing yoga that sets them apart from the otherwise hierarchical varnashrama dharma system of Indian society. And that again, this solidify in my mind, in my understanding, this idea that Nāth Yogis, at least, or tantric yogis, are about power understood positively as a manifestation of the sacred because it provides agency, it provides freedom, it provides ultimately immortality, and that it can be related conceptually to our ideas about magic, if the way that we understand this as something magical.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's very illuminating. And so based on that, putting all these pieces together, where is your work heading now? You have some current work, this sort of comparative approach to Crowley that I mentioned in your bio. But
Yeah.
especially as an independent scholar, and I've seen you on social media presenting at the Occulture conference in Berlin. Where is this trajectory taking you now?
Well, yes. Again, kind of, it sort of goes in two major directions. I mean, I have collaborated also with some other scholars. I mean, I have contributed to various anthologies. So Hugh
Hmm.
Urban and colleagues, and they invited me to write. I wrote a chapter about secrecy in Hindu tradition.
Okay.
That was for an anthology, Routledge anthology, I believe, for secrecy
Hmm.
in world religions in general. So I kind of contributed, and that kind of mostly dealt. That was a chapter that dealt mostly with the kind of a. Again, I approached Indian tradition and secrecy through this lens of esotericism, but it literally kind of just dealt with Indian tradition. I didn't go kind of a comparatively
Hmm.
aside if aside and beyond this concept of esotericism that I
Hmm.
took to be, again, is this a comparative concept? I don't even know anymore. So kind of I have contributed to this, and there is this. We have both attended the Occult South Asia conference in Vienna, and
Right.
kind of there is a
Hmm.
kind of a contributed chapter for this anthology that is still work in progress. I have recently contributed to the Appropriating the Tao, which was edited by Lucas Pokorny and Franz Winter. This
Yeah.
was about the reception of China in Western esotericism.
Hmm.
Recently finished chapter for Occult Tibet, where I was again looking at Crowley and Kenneth Grant and their approach to Tibet, their representation of Tibet. There was not much, to tell the truth. Yeah, and I'm kind of working on basically I have three books on Crowley that I would like to finish. Two of them are based on what he said was his life mission. He claimed that he actually experienced a vision of his previous lives, and that kind of he was given two tasks,
Hmm.
which were kind of his principal mission: to bring Oriental wisdom to Europe and to restore paganism in a purer form.
Hmm.
So I'm currently working on this
Hmm.
Thelema and the Oriental wisdom under quotation marks, because I'm using his terminology, where I'm looking at at his approach, his representation, and his incorporation of yoga, tantra, Taoism, Buddhism in his own writing, in his own system of Thelema, in his own various uh, organizational papers, etc. I would like after that to work on a book on Crowley and paganism, restoration
Hmm.
of paganism. That would involve reading lots of his poetry, and kind of that's a scary task. And
The hymn to Artemis isn't bad. I like that. Pan
yeah,
to Artemis.
yeah. And finally, I would like to write a book in which I'm kind of just would like to present Thelema as a new religious movement, which it is, but kind of again mostly from the perspective of religious studies, to
Hmm.
kind of look at the religious side of these of these concepts, and to kind of just focus on simply religious side of the whole thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. And kind of, yeah. So I'm kind of still publishing mostly through these various anthologies that I get invited to. And lately I'm kind of becoming sort of a regular at the Occultural Conference, which is a great gathering, great event in Berlin every 2 years.
Hmm.
Huge, lots of people. You should attend. You should present, yeah.
Yeah. You'd
There
be
are
happy to.
practitioners, there are artists, there are performers, lecturers, scholars, practitioners, scholars, lots of stuff, lots of people, concerts, music.
Hmm.
books, yeah. It's quite an interesting. Yeah, yeah. Recently, Hanegraaff presented, and he kind of had his impressions being known on Facebook, and he was quite impressed with the whole thing. So if the
Yeah.
leading scholars in the field are happy with it, I'm happy with it too. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, no, it sounds like a great event. I think I was going to attend several years ago and I couldn't. Something came up, and I'll look forward to the next one, maybe next year or something, or the year after.
I think it's every 2 years.
Every 2 years, yeah. So
Yeah. So next year, October.
great.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, anything left that you would like to add for,
And
posterity? Yeah.
can't think of anything. I mean, I'm simply happy that this field, study of esotericism, exists. I think conferences I attended, the books I read, people I met, that has all been superlative. I'm very happy to be kind of one part of it, to contribute to. Yeah. In that sense, times are interesting. They're also interesting in some other aspects which are not so nice. But yeah, this is quite something, and I'm very happy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, and hopefully something of this research can lead or inspire people to, have a better world, certainly.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Gordan, Dr.
Thank you.
Djurdjevic, and we appreciate your time. And lastly, where can people find you online, or if they want to connect with you more, or find your work? What's the best way?
I have my website is in progress. It is not yet done, and I'm thinking of coming up with one soon. But otherwise, I'm present at academia.edu.
Perfect. Okay.
People can find some of my work there. Yeah.
All right. I'll post your link then in the description.
And of course, kind of a social media. Yeah.
Sure. All
Okay.
right.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Kate. Bye.
কোথায় সে অটল রূপে